Okay, so for the third custom view app that we're making over here, we've got a similar looking blue view. The interesting thing about this now is that I'm going to be logging information when I press my button. So when I press down and I click down right here, you can see that log statements are filling up inside of this. It's counting something. And that if I delete this and go back and take a look at this, I can get those to count up again from the number 1. So if I press this again, you can see it goes 1 and 2 down here. So the question is, what is this counting? How are we making this count? And how are we triggering this whole process just by pressing down over here? How are we getting this? And the short answer is that we're using runnables. So I'm going to remove the log. I'm going to take a quick tour just to explain where we're getting in from here. So we've got our main activity. Main activity is very straightforward. All he does is he calls set content view. Remember, set content view loads in this XML file, activity main. The activity main file includes the class package name, the package name, and then the class name for my new view over here. So that's specifying this particular class. And then I have specifications that give it a height and a width. And then I use the app namespace, right? XML namespace app over here. I use the app namespace by positioning it in the middle of the top, bottom, start, and end of the parent, which effectively just centers this guy right in the middle over here. The class itself is a little bit more it's a little bit more interesting than the previous. And this guy uses a runnable. So runnables, the idea behind a runnable is that the runnable class gets passed. You have a handler, basically. You have a handler class over here. And the handler gets told to post delayed, which is to say, run some runnable method in some class. So we pass it two things. We pass it a class and a time. So the handler, the way to trigger a remote running of a function in the future is to take a handler, to call the post delayed method on the handler and say, run this object at this far in the future. So run whatever this object is right here at this far in the future. Whatever the object is assumed to implement runnable. So because I'm using the word this here, and because in Java this means the current class, the only reason that this isn't complaining, that this line isn't complaining, is because this current object must implement the runnable class. Okay, so which is to say that yes, my new view implements the runnable class. And by implementing the runnable class, I have this method run over here. So we almost have this, you can see this self-referential thing over here. So let's take a look and see what's exactly going on and follow the whole sequence of this thing. So from before, I have my constructor for my new view over here. This is the proper constructor used that uses the context and the attribute set. I extend the view class for this my new view, and I use the Android view class over here. Don't bother typing this stuff in, remember. You know, if I want to get in the view, I press Alt-Enter, and I auto-import. So don't worry about typing this all out by longhand. When I initialize my class, I set a count. This is going to be the count that runs up at the bottom. And then I make a new handler object, and this is the guy that's going to handle running things in the future. So this is the object that does things in the future. I define him as a member variable of the class, and I'm using the Android open source project naming convention over here by putting an M in front of these guys. So mCount, mHandler. In my touch event, the touch event is going to be the thing that we saw that triggers the actual starting of counting over here, right? So when I press touch over this, you can see that the count started to go up. I actually touched it twice. So something is happening in this touch event that triggers this. Okay, so from before, we get the action, we figure out the type of action that came in with this motion event over here, and then this event is always passed in a non-touch event, whether it's a movement or mouse down or finger up or whatever like that. And then I have a new variable over here, result is equal to true. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Oh, actually the result, I should have mentioned this in the last video. The result defines whether or not this class should consume the event. So let me just double check my reference and I'll come right back. So the return value talks about whether or not this event, this particular motion event, should be propagated up the chain. And it's kind of a little bit of out of context for this, like up the chain of containing views. So say, for example, this view, we're inside of a scroll view or a recycler view or some other like larger container. Returning true does not allow this event to be propagated upwards. So for example, if I returned true here, if I return true, I'm sorry, I keep pausing back and forth. This is legitimately confusing because I always goof myself up on this, and you'd think I just learned it after doing it for so many years, but for some reason it still trips me up. When I press true, the event is not propagated upwards, which is to say that, you know, if I wanted to scroll up or down this motion event and I wanted to drag, like while I'm clicking on here, I wanted to move the scroll view up and down. That's by returning true inside of this, that's not going to happen. And it's helpful in sort of synchronizing who you want to actually be getting the event, you know, who you want to grab the event. So anyway, I'm just returning true in this case. I'm also calling this method over here start counting. So start counting is what triggers this runnable, this handler from posting these events. So remember, we initialized our handler up in the class constructor, and I tell this handler, my handler over here, to post delayed, which is to say run the class object described here, run the method run and the class object described here this far in the future. So 100 milliseconds in the future, I'm going to run the run method in this class. This being the parent class over here, which implements the runnable. So his run method is right here, which is to say it increments the count. So at 100 milliseconds in the future, it increments the count, and then run gets kind of trapped into its own self over here, where 100 milliseconds in the future, it's going to keep running this guy, and 100 milliseconds in the future, it keeps running this guy. And so we keep logging this every 100 milliseconds in the future, as long as this button is down until we tell the handler to remove these callbacks, which is called by stop counting. So that release is going to trigger stop counting, which removes the callbacks. So callback functions being the things that are going to be called in the future, and that's basically the function of a runnable. Runnables are fantastic tools for running stuff in the future. So here, things are getting called in the future. I release, not getting called, and you can see the logcat counted for 22 100 millisecond intervals, and then it's done. And I can do this again, boom, 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 boom. They're all kind of running and accumulating down here, and now it's done. So here we have a runnable inside of a view. And that's that.